I'm Marion Brooks. Turned 68 last month, and most Sundays, you'll find me in my kitchen around 5 o'clock, setting the old table for dinner. I always use the faded blue china. Hugh and I got on our wedding day, though the pattern's almost worn away this particular evening. I had salmon in the oven, rosemary and lemon, just the way my grandchildren seem to like it. There's a lavender blouse I saved for special occasions, and as I smoothed the sleeves, I caught my own reflection in the dining room mirror. For a moment, I wondered if anyone would notice how hard I'd tried tonight, outside the window. The sky was just starting to go gray, and rain tapped quietly against the glass. Before we get into all that, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if you've ever felt invisible at your own family table. I hope you'll subscribe, and stay a while. I grew up, Marion Evans, back in a small town, where neighbors waved, and folks never locked their doors. My parents ran a corner grocery. Nothing fancy, but they put their whole heart into that store. Dad taught me to help folks without expecting anything back. Mom believed in keeping a tidy house and baking for every new neighbor. When I married Hugh Brooks, I carried those values with me. We settled into a quiet house just outside Springfield, raised our son Robert, and tried to give him the same sense of belonging I'd always known after Hugh passed away 5 years ago. That house became both a shelter and a reminder. Every photo, every dish, every worn-out chair told a story of some ordinary joy. Sunday dinners had been our anchor. Robert, his wife Cheryl, and their 2 kids would come over around 5:30, just like clockwork. I'd set out the good china fuss over the menu and pretend not to notice how quiet things had gotten. Lately, Robert used to fill the room with laughter and stories from work now. He'd answer with a word or two and keep his eyes on his phone. Cheryl brought wine that never tasted quite right and offered a tight smile that never reached her eyes. The grandkids, Daniel and Allie, wandered in, grabbed their plates, and disappeared back to their own corners of the house. I noticed how Allie picked at her food, how Daniel never said if he liked the salmon. I kept telling myself that was just how families drift. Sometimes the truth was, most days, I was just grateful for any time at all. But on this particular Sunday, I caught myself studying the empty seat at the table, the one Robert always used to help set when he was a boy. I asked about their week, their plans, the things that mattered, and for a second, it felt like the old days. But as the conversation faded and nobody looked up, something settled heavy in my chest, as if I was watching my own life from the outside, and I wondered when I'd become a guest in my own home. Next Sunday, I told myself maybe things would be different. But deep down, I could feel it changing, and I couldn't shake the sense that the ground was already shifting under my feet. I gathered the dinner plates, in quiet, careful movements, my mind drifting back over the evening, like someone replaying an old film reel, searching for missed details. Robert and Cheryl made quick work of dessert, barely touching their slices of apple pie, and when Daniel and Allie finished, they slipped away with a few muttered words, the TV flickering in the background. I watched them gather their things, Cheryl glancing at her watch, Robert already pulling on his jacket before I'd even stacked the forks. "We'll need to head out early," Cheryl said, "lots to get ready for before our trip." Robert nodded, offered the quick, "Thanks, Mom," and before I could ask about their plans, they were gone, the screen door shutting softly behind them. I stood at the sink, rinsing plates in warm, soapy water, listening to the house settle back into its hush. After I finished the dishes, I found a piece of paper on the floor under the table just beside Cheryl's chair. I bent to pick it up, intending to set it aside for next week, but my eye caught a line printed near the top. Booking confirmation, family tour to Disneyland. I turned it over, curiosity getting the better of me. There in neat rows were all their names: Robert, Cheryl, Daniel, Allie, Cheryl's parents, her sister, her niece, even a cousin I barely remembered from their wedding. 14 names in all. What struck me most was the line about the van, 15-seat passenger van, fully air-conditioned, with entertainment system. 14 people, but 15 seats. I set the paper down on the table, my hands trembling as I traced the list one more time. There was room. There had always been room. Just not for me. The rain outside had picked up steady and unhurried. I sat for a while in the dining room, the old blue china still drying on a towel beside me. My chest felt tight, as if the quiet in the house had somehow settled inside me. I thought about every time I'd brushed off being left out, every moment I'd told myself not to be a bother, every Sunday I'd pushed aside a question or a hurt feeling. I had always believed or tried to believe that these small exclusions were just life moving on. But sitting there, with the proof in my hand, a single empty seat offered to a cousin instead of a mother, there was no way to avoid the truth. I was not simply overlooked. I was left out on purpose. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in bed and listened to the familiar ticking of the old clock, the sound Hugh used to call the heartbeat of the house. I kept hearing the words from dinner, how they'd talked around me, how plans had already been set, how Cheryl's voice had turned gentle when she mentioned my arthritis. It was a faint ache in my knee most days, nothing that would keep me from a park bench or a stroll with the children, but somehow it had become a reason for me to stay behind. I turned the thoughts over and over, not with anger, but with a kind of numbness, like someone slowly realizing they're the only person left in the room. Morning came in gray and silent. I made tea, took a seat at the kitchen table, and unfolded the confirmation slip once more. I studied the names, the neat list of details. I remembered how when Hugh died, Robert had stepped in, handled the arrangements, checked on me, drove me to appointments, and little by little his visits grew less frequent. His calls more rushed, his children always too busy for stories or games. I tried to make myself useful, never saying no when they asked for help. At first it was babysitting for an evening, then it was weekends. Later, it was rides for Daniel's soccer practice or a check written quietly for Allie's dance lessons. I gave what I had time, money, attention, thinking it was what any mother or grandmother would do. I suppose I never noticed when it shifted, when I became more of a backup plan than a real part of their lives. The signs were their phone calls that came only when they needed something, invitations that dried up unless I was cooking or watching the children. I told myself this was just how things were when children grew up and started families of their own. But there in black and white was the fact that the circle could be closed without me, that my presence was something to be quietly subtracted if it made things easier. Later that morning, I looked around the kitchen and living room, at the photos lining the mantel, at the gifts the children had made for Mother's Day and birthdays. The house held all the echoes of our family life, the baby shoes, the graduation pictures, the old rocking chair Hugh loved. I thought about how each of those things told a story of love and togetherness, but I also felt the empty spaces, the gaps that had widened year by year. It was quiet, but not peaceful. The silence now seemed to have weight filling up every corner and shadow. I wondered when I'd stopped asking for anything, when I started believing that not being a bother was the most anyone could expect from me. I realized I had no idea what Robert or Cheryl wanted for themselves, not really, and I wondered if they had ever truly asked what I wanted for me. I moved through the day in small, steady steps, watering the plants, folding laundry, setting aside things for the thrift store, making a pot of soup out of habit more than hunger. Toward evening, I found myself standing in the hallway, hand on the family photo wall, the soft voices of old memories brushing past me. I thought about the girl I once was, the one who left her parents' house full of hope and plans, the woman who raised a son to be strong and independent, who believed that kindness and patience were always enough. I could see now that I'd become an afterthought, someone to be called on when it was convenient but quietly forgotten the rest of the time. That night, as I turned out the lights, I made a small promise to myself. I would not bring this up at the next dinner, would not demand an explanation, would not plead for an invitation. But I would not forget how it felt to be left out, how it felt to see my name missing from the list. I let myself stand in that truth, heavy as it was, and tried to imagine what it would mean to matter to myself, even if it meant mattering a little less to them. As I lay down to sleep, the sound of rain was still at the window, gentle but persistent, and I knew something inside me had changed, even if the world outside looked exactly the same. I woke before sunrise, the house still and quiet. I moved through the rooms the way I always did, starting the coffee and feeding the old tabby cat who'd outlasted Hugh by a year. The living room was washed in pale light. I looked around at the family photos arranged along the mantel faces, smiling back from birthdays and graduations. There was Robert as a boy missing his front teeth, Allie at her first dance recital, Daniel holding up a science trophy. Each frame seemed to hold its own little story, a reminder of a life built around caring for others. After breakfast, I sat in the armchair by the window, watching the world wake up. The street was empty, except for a paperboy pedaling by, tossing the morning news onto each porch. My mind drifted back over the years, thinking about the ways things had changed since Hugh passed. I remembered those first few months, how Robert came by almost every evening, how Cheryl would bring over casseroles, how the grandkids curled up on the couch to watch movies while I made popcorn in the kitchen. There had been laughter, gentle teasing, even a sense that life could carry on just different. It didn't happen all at once, the slow quieting of the house. At first, Robert called less often. Cheryl's errands became reasons to drop off the kids for an afternoon or weekend. If someone was sick or needed to be picked up from practice, my phone would ring. I learned to say of course before they even finished asking. I told myself that helping out was what any good mother or grandmother would do, that this was how families worked. I didn't notice when the favors turned into expectations. Babysitting went from once in a while to nearly every weekend. Grocery lists appeared in text messages, sometimes with a thank you, sometimes not. When Robert mentioned tight months, I reached for my checkbook before he could finish explaining. There were months I didn't buy new shoes or see the dentist because I was setting money aside for Daniel's summer camp or Allie's braces. I'd hear Robert say, "Mom always helps out," and Cheryl reply, "She loves spending time with the kids," and I'd nod, pretending I was grateful to be needed. The truth was, I missed feeling wanted, not just useful, but wanted. There was a difference, though. It was hard to explain even to myself. The hardest part was noticing how invisible I'd become in the day-to-day. Robert and Cheryl would plan trips or dinners with Cheryl's family, and I'd find out afterward when Daniel or Allie mentioned something offhand. "Grandma, remember when we went to the lake, Aunt Denise let us fish from the dock?" I'd smile and ask to see the pictures. Sometimes Robert would apologize for forgetting to invite me always with a reason. "We didn't want to bother you, Mom," or "It was just a quick trip." I tried to believe them, but after a while the explanations wore thin. My world shrank to the routines of the house, sorting laundry, clipping coupons, keeping a pot of soup simmering on the stove in case someone dropped by. On good days, I'd walk to the park or the library. But even there, I felt out of place, surrounded by couples or parents with small children. I'd sit on a bench, watching clouds drift over the rooftops, wondering where all the years had gone. Some evenings, I'd call an old friend from church, but the conversation always circled back to Robert and the kids, what they needed, what I was doing for them, how proud I was of their accomplishments. Sometimes I wanted to say more, to talk about how tired I felt, how I wished someone would ask how my day had gone. But the words never came, so I'd just say goodnight and hang up, letting the silence stretch on a little longer. Sunday nights were the loneliest. After the family left, the house seemed to echo with their absence. I'd gather up dirty dishes and scrape half-eaten food into the garbage. I'd sit at the table and let the quiet settle in, remembering years when we'd play board games or watch a movie together, Robert helping with the dishes, Allie curled up beside me on the couch. Lately, they all left as soon as dessert was over, always with someplace else to be. I tried to keep a calendar of the grandkids' activities, but it was hard to keep up. Swim meets, recitals, school projects, most of the time I learned about them after the fact. I told myself I was just forgetful, but deep down, I knew the truth. The invitations weren't coming because no one thought to send them. One afternoon, after a particularly quiet week, I picked up a photo album from the coffee table and started turning the pages. There were pictures of Robert as a little boy building sandcastles at the beach, Hugh holding him on his shoulders. There was one from our 20th anniversary, all of us squeezed into a tiny booth at Mary's Diner, candles flickering in melted red wax. I closed the album, my hands resting on the faded cover. For a long time, I just sat there feeling the years press in around me. I suppose I believed that if I just kept saying yes, kept making myself available, things would go back to the way they used to be. I kept my thoughts to myself, not wanting to be a burden, not wanting to ask for more than what was freely given. But after finding my name missing from that list for Disneyland, after seeing that 15-seat van with 14 names, and knowing there was room, something inside me felt different. It wasn't anger, not really. It was more like a quiet grief, the kind that settles into your bones and makes everything feel a little heavier. That week, I moved through my routines, but nothing felt quite the same. I heard Robert's voice in my head. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll see you next Sunday," and I wondered if he even remembered what Sundays meant to us. I kept busy with chores, baked bread, pulled weeds in the garden, dusted the shelves in the back bedroom. In the evenings, I sat with a book I couldn't concentrate on and let the cat curl up in my lap, grateful for the weight of another living creature close by. The house was always tidy, but it felt emptier with each passing day. Even the photos on the mantel seemed quieter. When the phone did ring, it was usually Robert asking if I could pick up the kids, or Cheryl checking to see if I'd found Daniel's missing math folder. I said yes, every time. It felt like all I had left to offer. Sunday came again, gray and drizzly, and I set the table as always. I put out the blue china and folded the napkins, just so hoping maybe something would be different this time. Maybe Robert would linger a little longer. Maybe Allie would want to play cards. Maybe Cheryl would ask me to join them for their next outing. The knock on the door came right on schedule, but their voices were subdued, their hugs perfunctory. Dinner passed with the usual small talk, the air filled with the clink of forks and the hum of the dishwasher in the background. After they left, I walked through the quiet rooms, turning off lights and drawing the curtains. The ache in my chest was no longer sharp. It was something dull and familiar, an old ache I'd carried for too long. I paused in the hallway, hand on the photo wall, and let myself wonder what life might look like if I stopped trying so hard to be the glue holding everything together. I didn't know the answer, not yet. But for the first time, I let myself imagine a future that belonged to me alone, even if it was just a small corner of peace and quiet. The thought was both strange and a little comforting, and as I made my way to bed, I promised myself I'd listen for that quiet voice, the one that had nearly been lost in the noise of taking care of everyone else. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming in, the cat curled at my feet. Something had shifted, even if I couldn't name it yet, and as I poured my coffee and watched the world outside my window, I felt the first stirrings of a question I hadn't let myself ask in years. What if there was more to my life than waiting for someone else to need me? As I reached for the phone, the possibilities felt endless and a little bit frightening. But I knew something was coming, something that would ask me to choose myself, maybe for the very first time. The morning sunlight reached across the kitchen table, catching the rim of my coffee mug and spilling onto the wood. The cat was already waiting by the door, tail twitching. I fed her and sat back down, a steady hum of traffic just barely reaching my ears from down the street. The house had a strange energy that day, quiet but expectant. It was the first time in a long while I let myself linger over breakfast, not rushing to get things done for someone else. I sat there, hands around the warm mug, and felt the ache that had crept into my chest the past few weeks. I kept thinking of the empty seat at Sunday dinner and the way my name had been missing from that list. The question kept turning over in my mind, softer now, but persistent. What would it mean to want something for myself? The phone book sat on the counter, the old kind, with the spine taped up from years of use. I hadn't opened it in ages, but today, after putting the dishes away, I reached for it and began to flip through. Most of the names were a blur, folks who'd moved or passed on, but one stood out, Jean Harmon. Jean and I had been friends since high school. We'd lost touch the way people do moves kids' busy years. She was the kind of friend you could call after months of silence and pick up right where you left off. My fingers hesitated over her number, but I pressed the keys and waited through 4 long rings. I was about to hang up when her voice came through, familiar as ever. "Hello?" I managed a shaky Jean. "It's Marion Brooks." There was a beat of silence, then her laughter, warm and bright. "Well, it's about time. Where have you been hiding?" The words caught me off guard. I sat down at the kitchen table and let myself talk first about nothing, old classmates, the weather, a pie recipe. Then, as the conversation circled around, I shared how things had been since Hugh passed, how Robert and Cheryl had grown distant, how the house had gone quiet. I told her about the family dinners that didn't feel like family anymore, about the Disneyland trip, about finding my own name missing from the list. Jean listened without interrupting the way she always had when we were younger. When I finished, there was a pause, then Jean said, "You know, Marion, I moved out to Willow Creek after my divorce. I found a little house by the water. I thought I'd be lonely, but it turns out sometimes it's the start of something good." I closed my eyes, picturing her at a window with the lake behind her, sunlight on her hair. "It's never too late to do something just for yourself," she said. "That's what I've learned." After we hung up, I felt lighter, like some part of me had been dusted off and set back in the sun. I pulled out a notebook and started a list of things I wanted, not for Robert, not for Cheryl, or the grandkids, but for myself. It was a short list, but honest. Paint again, walk on the beach, try a new recipe. Maybe visit Jean in Willow Creek just for the sake of adventure. In the days that followed, I noticed the routines I'd built around everyone else's needs. I started changing them little by little. I said no to a last-minute request for babysitting, telling Cheryl I had plans with a friend. I let Robert's call go to voicemail once, letting him solve his own problem. It felt odd at first, but there was a relief that came with not being needed every moment. I opened up an old wooden chest at the foot of my bed, the one where Hugh and I kept mementos. I found my watercolor set from years ago, brushes still bundled with a rubber band. That afternoon, I sat up at the kitchen table and let myself try painting the view from the window, the soft green of the lawn, the purple shadows under the old maple tree. The results weren't much, but my hands remembered the motions, the feeling of making something new. Jean called back a few days later and invited me out to Willow Creek for a weekend. I hesitated, then said yes. I spent Friday morning packing a bag, feeling equal parts nervous and hopeful. The drive was slow, but peaceful, fields and forests blurring past. When I arrived, Jean was waiting on the porch, arms open, laughter in her eyes. We spent the weekend walking by the lake, cooking simple meals, talking late into the night. She showed me the local art center, the farmer's market, even a little book club that met every month in the back room of a cafe. One evening, as we sat by the window, Jean asked, "What would you do if you could start over?" The question hung in the air between us, gentle but insistent. I thought of the blue china at home, the photo albums, the routines that no longer fit. I thought of the empty rooms, the feeling of waiting for calls that never came. "I don't know," I said, and realized it was the truth, but also a beginning. When I returned home, the house felt different. Not smaller, not emptier, but waiting. I made myself a cup of tea and walked out onto the back porch, the evening sky streaked with color. I sat with the quiet, letting it settle around me. There was a sense that something was shifting, that I could make choices of my own. Maybe small ones at first, but choices all the same. Later that week, I took out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. I wrote to Jean, promising to visit again soon. I wrote down a few more things for my list, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something new, a flicker of anticipation, a sense that there might be more ahead than just waiting for Sundays to roll around. The next morning, I stood in front of the hall mirror, brushing my hair, looking at a face that seemed both familiar and new. There was silver at my temples, lines at the corners of my eyes, but something else too, a kind of steadiness. I thought about what Jean had said about starting again, and felt the idea settle in my chest, like a secret. As I straightened my shoulders, I realized I was ready to see what came next, even if it was uncertain, even if it meant letting go of the way things had always been. That evening, the phone rang. It was Robert asking if I could take Allie to her music lesson after school the next day. I told him I was busy. No explanations, just the truth. There was a pause, then he said, "All right, Mom. I'll figure something out." I hung up and stared at the quiet phone for a moment, heart beating fast. Then I picked up my paintbrush, sat at the kitchen table, and let the evening light guide my hand. There would be more choices to make, but for now, I let myself feel the promise in that small word, yes. As the sky faded from blue to purple, I sat with the feeling of something beginning, not ending, and I knew the days ahead would bring changes I could not yet see. That week, the morning air carried a different weight, lighter, almost restless. I found myself walking from room to room, pausing at the windows, seeing the yard as if I were a visitor. The tall maple by the back fence, the chipped bird bath, even the faded welcome mat seemed to belong to someone else now. I went to the closet and began sorting through boxes, carefully setting aside things that mattered. A photograph of Hugh holding the baby, the quilt my mother stitched by hand, a handful of letters yellowed with age. The rest I stacked in piles for the thrift store or to offer to neighbors who might find use for them. Jean called one afternoon as I was folding linens. "You sound busy," she said. I told her about the boxes and the growing emptiness of the house. "You really mean it, don't you?" she asked. "You're ready." I didn't need to answer. She heard it in my silence. After hanging up, I made a list of what I'd need to do if I wanted to start over. Call a realtor, visit the credit union, find out what it would take to buy a small place in Willow Creek. The idea felt bold, even reckless, but also more real with each passing day. I called a local real estate office and spoke to a man named Mr. Daly, whose calm voice set me at ease. He said the market was strong for a house in my neighborhood, and if I decided to list things, could move quickly. "No rush," he added. "Just call me when you're ready." I spent the next few days finishing the sorting, labeling things for Robert and Cheryl, if they wanted them. Allie's old board games, Daniel's baby shoes. On Friday, after dropping off a box of winter coats at the church, I made my way downtown and stepped into Mr. Daly's office. Sunlight fell across his tidy desk as we discussed next steps. "We'll start with some photos and a sign out front," he said. "I'll handle the rest." As I left, a sense of quiet possibility settled over me. I walked to the coffee shop, ordered a cup, and sat near the window looking out at the familiar main street. For a moment, I let myself imagine living somewhere new. A place where I'd choose what color to paint the kitchen, where I'd walk to the water each evening, where the routines belonged to me alone. I thought of Jean's words and tucked them away, letting them grow roots. That night, I called Robert. He answered on the second ring, his voice distracted. "Hey, Mom, everything okay?" I told him I was planning to sell the house, that I needed something smaller, closer to the water. There was a long pause on the line. "You're really doing this?" he asked, and for the first time in a long time, I answered without apology. "Yes, Robert, I am." His reaction was cautious, a little uncertain, but he said he understood. "Just let me know if you need help," he added, his tone almost gentle. The next morning, I met with Mr. Daly at the house. He moved from room to room, making notes complimenting the care I'd put into the place over the years. "This home has good bones," he said. "People can feel that." I nodded, thinking of the lives lived within these walls, the laughter, the losses, the quiet Sundays. With the listing in place, things moved swiftly. I spent my days packing returning keys to neighbors, sharing small goodbyes with folks I'd known for decades. Each box loaded onto the truck felt like another step forward, a letting go of what no longer fit. In the evenings, I'd sit on the back porch with a cup of tea, feeling the hush of the house settling in for the night. It was both unfamiliar and peaceful, the silence not quite lonely. On the morning of the open house, I stood at the kitchen sink and watched the sun slip through the blinds. I thought about the years spent trying to hold everyone together and the way I'd started to come apart. I felt the difference now, the way my own hopes had room to breathe. I set the spare key on the counter for Mr. Daly, walked through each room once more, and locked the door behind me. I stayed with Jean for a few days while the papers were finalized. Her house felt warm, filled with small comforts, homemade soup, a worn deck of cards, the soft hum of a radio in the corner. She drove me around Willow Creek, showing me quiet neighborhoods, a bustling Saturday market, the art center she'd mentioned on the phone. One afternoon, she brought me to a small cottage just off the water's edge. The front porch sagged a bit, but the windows shone in the afternoon sun. I stepped inside, the scent of cedar and fresh paint drifting through the rooms. It was small, just enough for one, with space for a guest and a garden out back. That evening, over dinner, I told Jean I wanted to make an offer on the cottage. She smiled, squeezed my hand. "It's a good place, Marion. It suits you." I felt the last of my doubts slip away. The call from Mr. Daly came 2 days later. The house had sold, and the buyers wanted a quick closing. I signed the papers, my name shaking just a little at the bottom of each page. The process was simpler than I expected, less painful than I'd feared. When it was done, I called Robert and told him. There was a long silence. Then quietly, "I hope you'll be happy, Mom." With the sale finished and the cottage waiting, I packed the last of my things and left the house key with Mr. Daly. Jean and I loaded my boxes into her car, and we drove to Willow Creek as the sky turned gold above the fields. The new house felt like a blank canvas, empty walls, sunlight on the floors, the hush of possibility in every room. That first night, I sat on the porch as the wind came in off the lake, carrying the scent of rain. Jean joined me, and together we watched the sky fade from blue to a soft, silvery gray. "How does it feel?" she asked. I thought for a moment, then answered, "Like the beginning of something good." As the days passed, I settled into a quiet routine. I shopped at the corner market, joined Jean for walks along the water, found a painting class at the art center. I even introduced myself to the neighbor across the lane, a kind man named Ben, who taught me the names of the local birds. With each passing week, the cottage felt more like home. I knew change wasn't finished with me yet. I could sense something new rising, an unexpected challenge, maybe even a confrontation I couldn't avoid forever. But as the spring air drifted in through the open windows, I let myself rest in the moment, grateful for the chance to choose what came next. The next part of my journey was waiting just beyond the horizon, and I felt ready to meet it. The first morning in my new cottage, I woke to the sound of gulls outside the window and the gentle hush of the lake. I made coffee in my unfamiliar kitchen, opening cupboards twice before finding the sugar. The light fell soft and golden on the oak floors, and for a while, I simply sat at the table, breathing in the quiet. Boxes waited in the hallway, but there was no urgency. No one else's schedule to keep no chores for anyone but myself. I carried my cup out onto the small porch, settling in a faded wicker chair, feeling the sun on my hands and face. For the first time in years, there was nothing I needed to do but simply be. In the days that followed, I moved through my routines slowly. I hung up the old family photos in the front hall and set my mother's porcelain figurines on a shelf in the bedroom. The neighbors stopped by with little gifts, a pie from Ben and his wife, a vase of daffodils from the couple across the lane. Jean brought over extra towels and showed me how to work the finicky thermostat. The town itself unfolded gradually, each trip to the market or post office, bringing a new face, a friendly nod, a word of welcome. I started taking morning walks along the water, the path lined with wildflowers and pale sand. Each step felt lighter, the ache in my knees softened by the steady rhythm of the waves. Sometimes I'd pass a group from the art center easels propped on the grass, painting the way the sunlight danced on the lake. It reminded me of the little watercolor set I'd packed among my things, so one afternoon I unpacked it and brought it outside, sitting quietly in the backyard as I brushed pale blue and green across the page. The results were humble, but it felt good to make something for myself. It was during one of those afternoons, while I was clearing away empty moving boxes, that I found the letter. I'd tucked it away in my purse during the chaos of packing a plain white envelope with Robert's handwriting on the front. I hadn't noticed it in the flurry of the move. I sat on the edge of the bed, the late sun slanting through the blinds, and opened it with steady hands. The letter was short. Robert wrote that he and Cheryl were surprised I'd gone through with the move so quickly. He said the house already felt different without me there, emptier somehow. He asked if I'd found what I was looking for and told me the children missed me. Then, near the end, he wrote, "I hope you're happy, Mom. I know you gave us everything you had. Maybe it's time you took a little for yourself." I set the letter on the nightstand and sat with the words for a long while. There was no apology, not really, but something in Robert's message settled the last of the heaviness in my chest. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into my purse. One evening, as dusk settled over the town, Jean came by to invite me to dinner. Her house was filled with laughter, the smell of roasting chicken, and the chatter of friends gathered around her kitchen table. I listened to stories about local politics and fishing trips about grandchildren and gardens, and felt myself gently drawn into the circle. Later, as we washed dishes together, Jean asked if I'd thought about joining the art center's painting group. "You've always had a good eye," she said. "Besides, it's more about community than competition." The next morning, I walked down to the art center, heart thumping in my chest. A few women greeted me at the door, their voices easy and warm. I signed up for a Tuesday afternoon class, promising myself I'd show up even if I felt nervous. That first class, my hands shook as I mixed paint, but by the end of the afternoon, I found myself laughing along with the others, our canvases lined up along the wall, each one different. The instructor, a woman in her 70s named Harriet, stopped beside me and nodded. "You see the world a little differently, Marion. That's a gift. Don't be afraid to use it." As the weeks passed, my days filled with new routines. Coffee on the porch walks along the lake, painting in the studio dinners with Jean and her friends. Sometimes I'd call Robert or Cheryl in the evenings, checking in on the grandchildren, listening to the familiar rhythms of their lives. I missed them, but the ache wasn't as sharp anymore. I knew they were all right, and I knew I was too. It was during this stretch of gentle days that a different letter arrived this time, in a crisp business envelope addressed in Robert's hand. Inside were a few lines explaining that the bank had reached out to him about a loan he'd taken backed by the house I'd just sold. He didn't ask for help, but the words between the lines were heavy with worry. I sat in my kitchen, turning the letter over in my hands, understanding now how far things had slipped without anyone saying so. That evening, I spoke to Jean about it. She listened, nodding as I explained. "You can't go back, Marion," she said softly. "You did what you needed to do. They'll figure it out, even if it's hard." The next morning, I wrote a reply to Robert, steady and brief. I told him I was sorry for the trouble, but hoped he'd understand why I'd needed to make this change. I told him the cottage was always open if he or the kids wanted to visit. I put the letter in the mailbox, then spent the afternoon painting a small canvas of the lake in spring, the water soft and blue. Days slipped by. Sometimes I found myself thinking of all the years I'd spent waiting, all the times I'd tried to hold everything together. Now, with each sunrise over the water and each simple dinner in my own kitchen, I felt that tightness unwind. I still carried love for my family, but it was no longer tangled up in duty and sacrifice. One morning, as I sat at the window, Ben from across the lane knocked on my door and asked if I'd like to join a few neighbors for cards that evening. I agreed, letting myself step into something new. The cottage, with its bare walls and morning light, began to feel more like home. As spring deepened into early summer, word came that Robert and Cheryl were working through their own changes. The house in town had sold, and they'd found a smaller place not far from my old neighborhood. I called and congratulated them, listening, as Robert told me quietly that things were going to be all right. I knew there were still conversations to have, old wounds to mend, but I let myself hope that for the first time in years, those conversations could happen on equal ground. I was no longer just the caretaker or the afterthought. I was someone with a life of my own, a place in the world that belonged to me. That night, as the last of the daylight faded over the lake, I stood on the porch and listened to the quiet, grateful for the new chapter I'd begun. I knew there was more ahead, but for now, I let the gentle peace of that moment carry me forward, ready to face whatever came next. The day Robert finally came to visit, the sun was barely up, and the cottage was filled with the gentle hush of a new morning. I had just finished brewing a fresh pot of coffee when his car pulled into the drive, tires crunching softly on the gravel. For a moment, I stood by the window, watching him gather his courage on the front steps, the weight of our unspoken questions hanging in the cool air. I opened the door before he could knock, stepping aside as he entered, the familiar set of his shoulders, looking older, heavier than I remembered. He paused in the living room, taking in the rows of watercolor paintings on the mantel, the well-worn quilt draped across the couch, the soft clutter of a life rebuilt from the ground up. "It's nice here, Mom," he said quietly, glancing around as if trying to map the distance between us. I poured him a cup of coffee, setting it in front of him at the little kitchen table where sunlight streamed in through the curtains. We sat in silence for a minute, the steam from our mugs curling into the hush. Robert cleared his throat. "I thought I'd come see you before the kids start school again," he said. "Cheryl's with them today. She thought it might be better for just the two of us." I nodded, letting him take his time. His eyes rested on the stack of mail beside the fruit bowl, some bills, a postcard from Jean, a letter from the art center inviting me to display a painting at the next local show. "You really did it," he said, a touch of wonder in his voice. "You left." I waited, letting the words settle. Robert reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded letter. "I got this from the bank," he said. "They called the loan." He looked up, searching my face for anger or blame. "We managed to sell the house. We'll be all right. It's just different now." His voice faltered, then steadied. "I'm not here to ask you for anything, Mom. I just wanted to look you in the eye and say I understand, at least a little. I see why you had to do what you did." I watched him seeing again the boy who used to chase fireflies in the yard, the young man who left home for college with a suitcase and a shy grin. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, not exactly. He was offering something smaller and quieter, a truce maybe, or the first step towards something more honest. "Thank you, Robert," I said. "I hope you'll come back next time with Cheryl and the kids. There's a little park down by the water they'd love." He managed a smile. "I think we will," he said, fingers tracing the rim of his cup. We talked a while about ordinary things, how the market was doing, what sports the children were playing, how Jean was thinking about starting a book club for the neighborhood. The conversation wandered, growing easier with each passing minute. Later, Robert stood by the door, hesitating. "I'm sorry about how things ended up with the house. I shouldn't have assumed anything. I guess I thought things would always be the same." I reached for his hand, pressing it between my own. "Nothing stays the same forever, Robert, and that's all right." He squeezed my hand, and for the first time in years, I saw a hint of relief in his eyes. He walked to his car, pausing at the end of the drive to look back at the cottage framed in sunlight. As he drove away, I stood in the doorway for a long time, breathing in the quiet. There was sadness, yes, but also a strange lightness. Something new and honest had begun between us, even if neither of us could name it yet. That evening, Jean stopped by with a loaf of fresh bread, asking how the visit went. We sat on the porch, watching the colors fade on the lake. It wasn't easy, I told her, but it was good. She nodded, pouring us each a glass of iced tea. "Sometimes good things take a while to grow," she said. The next week, I received a call from Cheryl. She wanted to bring the children for a weekend by the lake before the school year started. I felt a rush of hope and nerves, wondering how they'd feel seeing me here in this new place outside the old rhythms. When they arrived, the children were shy at first, clinging to Cheryl's side, glancing around at the unfamiliar walls. I led them to the backyard, showing them the little garden where tomatoes and sunflowers stood in tangled rows. By afternoon, they were running along the shoreline, collecting smooth stones and shells, laughing as if the past few months had never happened. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Cheryl sat with me on the porch. "Robert's different lately," she said, her voice low. "Quieter maybe, but lighter too. I think he's learning something. We both are." We watched the stars come out, the air growing cool, and I felt a quiet peace settle between us. The weekend slipped by in a blur of small moments. Pancakes at the kitchen table, watercolor lessons in the sunroom, stories shared under a quilt as the wind rattled the windows. When Sunday came and they packed the car to leave, Cheryl hugged me tightly. "We'll come back soon," she promised. After they left, the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, open, hopeful, waiting for what might come next. I cleaned the kitchen, watered the garden, and wrote a letter to Jean, thanking her for all the small kindnesses that had brought me to this place. I knew there would still be hard days and old habits that tried to creep back in. But as the sun set over the lake, I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, knowing that I had found a new way forward, not just for myself, but for the people I loved. There was more to come, more to heal, more to build, and as the stars came out, I let myself rest in the gentle quiet, ready for whatever the next morning would bring. Summer drifted quietly into fall, and the days settled into a gentle rhythm along the coast. Each morning, I would wake to the sound of the surf, open the windows to the sea breeze, and feel a sense of belonging I hadn't known in years. There was work to do, small things that gave shape to my days, like tending the tomato plants, volunteering at the museum, and learning to paint the shifting colors of the sky. Most evenings ended on the porch, wrapped in a soft blanket, watching the lights come on in the neighbors' homes and letting the memories of my old life settle, no longer heavy, just part of the story. When Robert and Cheryl brought the children to visit again, I could see how the distance had changed us, but in a way that felt honest. We sat together by the water, collecting stones and shells, and for the first time in a long while, our conversations felt easy. There was no undercurrent of old obligation, just a gentle kind of understanding that we were all doing our best to build something new. I watched as Robert helped his daughter skip rocks across the waves, and I saw him glance my way, offering a small, grateful smile. It wasn't a perfect reunion, but it was real, and that was enough. The friends I'd made in Sunset Bay became a kind of found family people who knew me, not just as someone's mother or grandmother, but as Lorna, a woman with her own hopes, her own laugh, her own quiet resilience. There were potlucks and card games and late-night talks that lasted long after the moon had risen. On those evenings, surrounded by easy laughter, I felt the ache of loneliness begin to fade. Sometimes I would think back to the house I left behind, the faded photos, the worn dishes, the echoes of voices that once filled every room. I missed it, but not in the way I feared. Letting go had not left me empty. It had made space for a different kind of love, one rooted in respect, honesty, and the freedom to choose my own days. It took me nearly 7 decades to learn that dignity is not something another person gives you, but something you choose for yourself, moment by moment. I realized that setting boundaries and asking for kindness is not selfish. It's a way of teaching the world how you wish to be treated. Justice for me wasn't about punishment or payback. It was the quiet strength to walk away from what hurt and to trust that something better waited if I was brave enough to reach for it. When the holidays came, the family gathered in my little house by the sea, smaller than before, but warm and full of light. There were still rough edges, still moments of awkwardness or old wounds that surfaced when no one expected. But as we sat around the table sharing stories and laughter, I understood that this was what I'd always hoped for, not a perfect life, but a real one, a life where I could be seen and loved for who I am. If there's one thing I wish I'd learned sooner, it's that it's never too late to choose yourself, to begin again, and to open the door to the life you deserve. No matter how old you are, or how many years you spent waiting for others to change, you always have the right to change your own story. Thank you for listening to mine. If this story found you at just the right moment, I hope you'll take a breath. Reflect on what you need, and remember, you're not alone. Share your own story if you'd like, or simply hold this one close. And if you'd like to join me for more, you know where to find me.